Most people believe that feeling is a virtue, that crying, loving, and fearing makes them more human, but what if that's exactly what makes them weak? What if emotions aren't a sign of life, but rather an invisible chain that others use to move us at their will? In the game of power, those who are swayed by what they feel have already lost before they even start. The mind that doesn't master its emotions becomes the toy of those who know how to control them. Machiavelli understood this by observing the suffering, betrayal, and downfall of the powerful. He saw how kings crumbled because of love, how the most cunning men became prey to their pride, and how compassion, this supposed virtue, became their sentence. It was then that he discovered a truth that few dare to accept. Those who feel without control are controlled. And at that moment, Machiavelli stopped being a man driven by the heart and became a strategist driven by reason. This is not a story about coldness, but about mastery, about how one man decided to rewrite the rules of power and trained himself not to feel, not because he hated emotions, but because he understood their value and their danger. What you're about to discover is not just a historical lesson, but an X-ray of the human mind. How emotional weakness can be transformed into the most lethal tool of control. Stay. Because what you are going to learn could change the way you understand morality, power, and yourself. Subscribe to this channel, and comment the word power to take back control of your life. Segment 1. The observation of pain. Machiavelli lived in an era where power was a currency paid with blood, and the smallest mistake could cost a kingdom. From the shadows of the Renaissance, he watched how the most feared men in the world destroyed themselves without the need for a visible enemy. Love weakened them, anger blinded them, guilt disarmed them. Each emotion became an invisible crack that ultimately brought down empires. For Machiavelli, pain was not just suffering. It was information, a window into human vulnerability, a laboratory where he could study the anatomy of failure. While others lamented, he analyzed. Each fall of a leader was an emotional experiment, each betrayal a lesson in strategy. He saw how the wisest kings surrendered to their passions, how fear made even the bravest warriors retreat, how compassion became the poison of the powerful. In his mind, an idea was forged that bordered on the heretical. Emotions were not virtues. They were traps, a weapon so dangerous that when not controlled, it would be used against you by those who knew how to manipulate it. Machiavelli understood that the true battlefield was not in politics, nor in armies, nor in the walls of Florence. The deadliest battle took place within the human being. There where pride demands revenge, where fear paralyzes, and where desire clouds reason.
In that invisible place, the fate of men was decided.
Those who did not know how to fight against their own pain ended up being slaves to it. And so began his silent training, observing suffering without allowing it to consume him, analyzing the wound without yielding to it, dissecting fear like a surgeon of the soul. Machiavelli discovered that pain, when viewed through the eyes of a strategist, could be turned into power. That each disappointment could reveal the internal structure of control, and that every tear contained the map of human weaknesses. The enemy, he realized, rarely carries a sword. It doesn't arrive shouting, nor does it announce itself with wars. It lives in the mind, disguised as emotion, attachment, compassion. It is an internal saboteur that feeds on impulse, seducing the ego to act without thinking. Machiavelli identified it, studied it, and turned it into his most important adversary. Because only those who conquer their inner world can dominate the outside world. From that moment on, his perspective changed. He no longer saw people, he saw patterns. He no longer saw feelings. He saw strategies disguised as weakness. Machiavelli did not become insensitive. He became lucid. He understood that pain, when observed without fear, reveals the hidden design of power. And from that knowledge was born his greatest strength, the ability to feel, without being dominated by what he felt. Segment 2. The betrayal that shaped him. Machiavelli was not born cold. No one is born without emotions. They learn to silence them. His metamorphosis was not the result of a natural talent, but of a betrayal that burned his faith in humanity. He served with loyalty, believed in reason, defended his republic, and in return he was cast into darkness. The very men to whom he offered his intellect delivered him as a political sacrifice. They humiliated him, tortured him, stripped him of his name. In that abyss where most break, Machiavelli began to observe with the eyes of a predator. Physical pain was only a mask. What truly transformed him was psychological pain, the weight of discovering that betrayal does not come from enemies, but from allies. That truth opened a crack in his mind, and instead of filling it with resentment, he filled it with observation. Every scream of desperation, every accelerated heartbeat, every thought that brushed madness became a source of information. Machiavelli did not flee from suffering, he dissected it. He analyzed it as if it were an emotional experiment from which he could learn the structure of control and obedience. Dark psychology is born precisely there, in the moment when the individual stops resisting pain and begins to study it. Machiavelli understood that everything that dominates man, fear, guilt, hope, love, can be manipulated if its root is understood. While his body was being punished, his mind expanded. Suffering ceased to be a wound and became a laboratory. Betrayal, instead of destroying him, rebuilt him. It was in that darkness that he understood that those who manage to keep their consciousness awake while their world collapses are closer to power than madness. The old Machiavelli died in those invisible cells. In his place, something colder, more lucid, and more lethal was born. Not a monster, but an emotional strategist who understood that control is not about nullifying emotions, but about submitting them. Every sensation that would have destroyed him before was transformed into a tool. He learned to breathe within fear without drowning, to see humiliation as an X-ray of others' vanity, and to understand that misdirected compassion is a weapon that the powerful should never wield. Instead of dying inside, Machiavelli reprogrammed himself. He rewrote the connections between pain and response, between emotion and action. He turned suffering into strategy, despair into discernment, and betrayal into his most valuable training. What others called defeat, he called learning. And so, from the ruins of his humanity, he emerged with a redesigned mind, immune to manipulation, impervious to guilt, and able to observe chaos without becoming a part of it. Segment 3. The invisible training. Machiavelli's true training ground was not in the courtyards of palaces or on the battlefields, but within his own mind. Where common men drown in their emotions, he decided to learn to breathe. His training was not physical, it was psychological. A slow, cruel, and deliberate process where every thought was dissected, every impulse analyzed, and every emotion faced without mercy. He did not seek to eliminate what he felt, but to isolate it, understand it, and place it under his control. His mind became a silent laboratory where emotion was the raw material, and control, the final result. He learned that a man's power is not measured by his strength, but by his ability to remain unshaken in the midst of chaos. That feeling anger does not mean reacting with anger. That sadness does not demand surrender. That fear can be observed as a phenomenon and not as a sentence. While the rest of the world acted on impulse, Machiavelli acted on calculation. He turned pain into analysis, frustration into strategy, anxiety into observation. His mind began to operate like an emotionally neutral machine, one that responded only when convenience dictated it. This kind of mastery belongs to the darkest realm of human psychology, where emotions cease to be spontaneous and become tools. Machiavelli understood that those who control their minds control the minds of others. Most people react. He decided to observe. Most defend themselves. He learned to anticipate. His training consisted of breaking the automatic association between feeling and acting, replacing instinct with strategy. He discovered that true coldness is not the absence of emotions, but the surgical control of when and how to let them out. Each day he reinforced that invisible wall between his inner world and the outer one. If insulted, he meditated on the effect of the insult before responding. If manipulated, he analyzed the manipulation pattern instead of getting outraged. His power lay in the delay, that second of clarity between stimulus and response, where others fall and the strategist rises. Machiavelli knew that in that small space lies absolute dominance, the place where control becomes power and impulse becomes weakness. Slowly, his mind transformed into a fortress without doors. From the outside, he seemed serene, distant, impenetrable, but within that calm dwelled a mind in constant observation, an emotional architect who could feel without allowing what he felt to govern him. His invisible training was not an act of repression, but of transmutation. He learned to use anger as energy, sadness as focus, fear as a radar. Machiavelli became an emotional strategist, a man capable of walking through the storm without getting wet, of observing pain without yielding to it, of using emotion as a weapon without becoming its victim. He mastered his impulses so that no one could ever dominate him. And in that process, he achieved the purest form of power, the absolute control of himself. Segment 4. The Illusion of Freedom Society teaches that feeling freely is synonymous with authenticity, that expressing oneself without filters is a sign of emotional strength. But Machiavelli understood something darker, that supposed freedom is an invisible cage, a prison disguised as virtue. Those who believe that being free means reacting to everything they feel have already handed over the keys to their mind. Emotion without control becomes a rope that others can easily pull, a conditioned reflex that obeys without question. Machiavelli called it invisible slavery because it doesn't need chains, just overflowing emotions. The easiest men to control are those who believe no one controls them, those who boast of following their heart while walking exactly where someone else is leading them. Dark psychology feeds on them because those who don't master their inner world become instruments of those who do. Anger can be provoked, guilt induced, desire manipulated, and so those who think they are free end up being puppets moved by impulses, unaware that someone else holds the strings. Machiavelli observed that power doesn't need to impose itself through force when it can disguise itself as emotion. A leader doesn't need to punish if they can inspire fear, doesn't need to convince if they can awaken hope, doesn't need to reason if they can manipulate guilt. He discovered that collective emotions are easier to direct than individual thoughts. While everyone believes they are choosing, they are actually reacting. The illusion of emotional freedom is the most effective tool for taming human will. This understanding led him to reject the romantic idea of emotional sincerity. For him, emotion shouldn't be expressed but interpreted. Every tear, every smile, every outburst was a signal of the psychological map of men, a clue as to where they were vulnerable. The people who shout for justice can be directed with fear. Those who cry for compassion, manipulated with promises. Machiavelli saw collective emotion as a tool of dominance so powerful that it could overthrow kingdoms without the need for swords. True freedom, he thought, doesn't lie in feeling without limits, but in choosing which emotion to allow to manifest. Those who control what they feel choose their own destiny. Those who don't simply execute the destiny that others have designed for them. Machiavelli did not seek to eliminate emotions, but to unmask them. He wanted to understand how a sigh could move armies, how a glance could subdue wills, how a word laden with emotion could alter the course of history. This is how manipulators are born, the architects of others' emotions. And this is how the naive fall, those who confuse intensity with freedom, those who believe that feeling is power when, in reality, it is surrender. Machiavelli understood that true control is not about dominating others, but about dominating how they believe they are free, because the most dangerous freedom is the one that doesn't exist, yet everyone swears they possess. Segment 5. The birth of the cold master, Machiavelli did not destroy his emotions. He transmuted them. He understood that trying to extinguish them was as futile as trying to put out a fire with one's hands. Instead of fighting against them, he observed them until he understood their deepest structure. He discovered that every emotion has a hidden language, a primal pulse that can become either energy or weakness, depending on who controls it. Coldness for him was not emptiness but absolute control, the ability to remain calm while the world burns. That serenity was not natural. It was trained, cultivated with the precision of a mental alchemist. Dark psychology teaches that true power comes from the ability to manipulate one's emotional state before manipulating that of others. Machiavelli understood this centuries before there was a name for this practice. He turned fear into vigilance, anger into strategic impulse, sadness into introspective analysis. Every emotion that would have overwhelmed him before transformed into refined fuel for his thinking. His mind became a laboratory where the irrational was dissected and reconstructed in the service of reason. That balance between fire and ice became his trademark. It was not indifference. It was mastery. He knew when to show compassion to plant trust, when to feign anger to instill respect, when to remain silent to provoke uncertainty. Nothing about him was improvised. Machiavelli embodied the darkest principle of psychological power. Those who control their emotions can control those of others, because calm confuses, serenity intimidates, and the lack of reaction destroys the enemy's power. He understood that coldness should not be seen as cruelty, but as clarity, An emotionally neutral man does not fear, does not rush, does not betray himself, and in that state he becomes a mirror where others project their fears. Machiavelli trained himself not to offer signals, to be an impenetrable surface. The absence of visible emotion made him a mystery, and in the realm of psychology, the mystery always dominates those who seek to understand it. This transformation led him to a new kind of power, silent power. A power that does not impose itself by force but by mental stability, because the man who can feel without reacting becomes invisible in the face of chaos, and the one who remains invisible controls the scene from the shadows. Machiavelli became that, a mind that operated between emotion and reason, between instinct and strategy, capable of observing without being affected. Thus the cold master was born, a being who did not need to demonstrate authority, because his presence imposed it. His calm became a threat, his gaze a question, his silence a sentence. He was not a man without emotions. He was a man who had domesticated them. Machiavelli understood that true strength is not about not feeling, but about feeling, and continuing to act as if nothing could disturb you. That is the supreme art of control, to turn emotion into obedience. Segment 6. The Anatomy of Control. Machiavelli understood that power was not a matter of strength, but of emotional anatomy. Every human mind, no matter how rational it seems, is driven by invisible stimuli that shape its behavior. Fear, desire, guilt, hope. He didn't just recognize them, he dissected them. He wanted to understand the structure of each emotion, what fibers he had to touch to alter the will of men without them noticing. His study was not political, it was anatomical, a dissection of the human soul under the cold light of strategy. Fear was the first to reveal its structure. Machiavelli discovered that fear does not paralyze but directs. It is a psychological anchor that pushes the individual toward obedience, when made to believe that security depends on another. He who masters fear masters submission. That's why he understood that it wasn't necessary to rule by the sword if he could rule by threat. A frightened man does not think, he only seeks refuge, and he who offers that refuge, even if illusory, becomes his master. Loyalty, for its part, was not a moral value, but a carefully stimulated emotional reaction. Machiavelli discovered that devotion is built not with genuine love, but with a precise mix of recognition and dependence. When someone feels their identity or survival depends on another, loyalty stops being a choice and becomes a reflex. Great leaders, he said, did not conquer territories, they conquered emotions. Loyalty is not demanded, it is manufactured. He also understood that reason, that bastion of human logic, could be deactivated with surgical precision. Emotions, when manipulated correctly, cloud the mind more effectively than any argument. A mind inflamed with anger stops analyzing. A mind intoxicated with admiration stops questioning. Machiavelli learned to generate those states in others. He discovered that the human mind, subjected to the right stimulus, becomes a predictable mechanism. Emotion, used with intelligence, was a weapon more precise than steel. His study of human psychology was the work of an alchemist of the soul. He mixed emotions like ingredients in an elixir, fear with hope, guilt with redemption, desire with guilt. He learned that control does not depend on eliminating emotions, but on orchestrating them. Every word, every gesture, every silence could be calibrated to trigger a specific response. What for others was empathy, for him was emotional engineering. Thus, he deciphered the anatomy of control, understanding that humanity is not dominated through pain or force, but through a deep knowledge of its weaknesses. Machiavelli saw that power does not belong to the most violent, but to the most aware. He who understands how to ignite fear, how to plant loyalty, and how to extinguish reason, holds the key to the collective soul, and with that key he can open any door, even those that morality forbids to touch. Segment 7. Silence as a weapon. For Machiavelli, silence was more than the absence of sound. It was a calculated presence. While the crowd shouted truth that only concealed weaknesses, he allowed himself the dangerous luxury of not speaking. In that apparent void, a fierce attention was concentrated, listening without being heard, recording without being recorded. Silence in his logic was not passivity, but an active strategy that created psychological spaces where others exposed themselves. In a world saturated with noise and exposure, Those who remain silent impose an uncomfortable pause. Machiavelli understood that people fear the absence of response more than the wrong answer. An unanswered question forces the interlocutor to fill the void with their own assumptions, projecting intentions and fears that were previously hidden. Thus, the strategist turned the lack of words into a mirror where others' intentions were reflected, and from that reflection, he obtained information that no interrogation could have revealed. Each silence was calibrated. It was not about omitting all the time, but about choosing when words multiply and when reserve destroys. Machiavelli practiced emotional restraint. He learned to measure the value of a phrase and hold it back for the moment when its release would have a seismic effect. Silence amplified authority. He who does not need to fill the air with noise conveys the impression of being above the exchange, possessing resources that should not be displayed. Restraint became his language of power. Silence was also a weapon of slow manipulation. A look without explanation, a calculated delay, a reproach not spoken, all forms of pressure that excite the other person's mind and push them toward predictable mistakes. Machiavelli understood that uncertainty produces urgency, and urgency causes people to act against their real interests. With patience, the strategist cultivated scenarios where others rushed while he maintained his composure, using inaction as a tool to provoke reactions that he could later exploit. Moreover, silence protected. In the privacy of inner reserve, Machiavelli concealed his intentions, avoiding giving signals that others could read. Where others left emotional breadcrumbs like crumbs, he kept his mouth shut and erased the trail. This made him unpredictable, a dangerous territory for those who depend on patterns to manipulate. His lack of transparency was a strength that prevented the creation of effective counter-strategies. Silence was his lesson in psychological domination. It taught that not always the loudest wins, but the one who uses silence as a tool.
In that dark art, words regain their maximum value. Spoken at the precise moment with the right intensity, they can break wills, reorder loyalties, and redraw alliances.
Machiavelli turned not speaking into an act of power, and learned to use that power to shape behavior without showing the hand that moves it. Segment 8. The sovereign mind. Machiavelli reached a mental state that few men achieve: inner sovereignty. He no longer sought to govern others but himself. By mastering his emotions, he freed himself from the invisible dictates of approval, fear, and desire. In a world governed by passions, his mind became an inviolable territory, a fortress built on the deepest understanding of the human soul. It wasn't indifference, but independence. He understood that absolute power is born when the environment no longer has power over you. Dark psychology teaches that most men are governed by forces they don't even perceive. The need to be loved, the fear of rejection, the addiction to validation, the urgency to stand out. These are all forms of slavery disguised as noble motivations. Machiavelli stripped these mental traps one by one. He identified the mechanics behind each impulse and, by doing so, deactivated them. He understood that those who are emotionally dependent on others' recognition become voluntary subjects, beings whose will is bargained for acceptance. This understanding transformed him. His mind ceased being a battlefield and became a throne. Every emotion that once sought to dominate him was turned into counsel. He no longer feared losing because there was nothing external that defined his worth. He no longer sought to please because he understood that approval is a refined form of control, and he no longer desired power because he possessed it by not needing it. The sovereign mind does not react. It evaluates, decides, and acts while the rest of the world is consumed by impulses. The inner mastery Machiavelli achieved was not a mere philosophy. It was a form of mental engineering. He watched how men weakened by trying to change the external, while he strengthened by changing the internal. He dismantled the link between emotion and dependence, between pleasure and submission. When fear lost its power over him, controlling others lost its meaning. The sovereign mind neither submits nor imposes. It simply exists above the emotional manipulation structures that govern the majority. Thus, Machiavelli discovered the true core of power: psychological impenetrability. There is no more dangerous weapon than a mind that cannot be invaded. In dark psychology, that is the pinnacle of domination. Not the conquest of others, but the impossibility of being conquered. His serenity was no longer a facade, it was his armor. Every stimulus from the world, every provocation, bounced off an invisible wall made of self-awareness. Machiavelli did not need thrones or armies to achieve the power he sought. He found it within himself, where no betrayal could reach him, where fear could not take root. That sovereign mind became his deepest legacy, the demonstration that real power is not owning the world but not belonging to it. Because when no one can touch what you think or alter what you feel, you have stopped being an ordinary human, and you have become something much more dangerous. Segment 9. The Art of Manipulating Without Touching. Machiavelli discovered that true control does not require shouting, threats, or force. He realized this by observing leaders who ruled without raising their voices, men who moved armies with a single phrase, and those who destroyed reputations with silence. He understood that the most effective manipulation is not exerted over the body, but over perception. It is not about physically dominating the other, but infiltrating their mind and guiding it where you want it to go, while the other believes they arrived there by their own will. That was the art of manipulating without touching, the invisible mastery of human thought. Dark psychology teaches that mental control is not achieved by imposing an idea, but by making the other adopt it as their own. Machiavelli applied this principle with surgical precision. He knew that the human ego is the best ally of the manipulator. When someone feels they have decided for themselves, they do not resist. When they believe they are acting by conviction, they are actually fulfilling an order that was never spoken. Thus, the strategist becomes a silent architect of wills, capable of directing behaviors without confrontation. Language became his most lethal tool. Every word was a seed designed to germinate in the other's mind and shape their thinking from within. He learned to use ambiguity as a shield and suggestion as a sword. He said just enough to activate an emotion, hinted enough for the other's mind to complete the idea itself. He understood that the most elegant manipulation is not imposed but whispered. Direct words provoke resistance, but those that appeal to the subconscious open doors that reason cannot close. He also understood the power of gesture, tone, and silence. A gaze held longer than necessary could awaken insecurity. A pause in the middle of a conversation could sow doubt or curiosity. Machiavelli knew that human beings read emotions more than arguments, and that those who master nonverbal language control the emotional atmosphere. In his mind, communication was a choreography. Every movement calculated, every expression a key that opened the other's emotions. The art of manipulating without touching is based on an unsettling truth. Men do not act by logic, but by emotional impulse. If that impulse is controlled, their destiny is controlled. Machiavelli did not need orders, only stimuli. One word that awakened fear, a hint that ignited desire, or a promise that offered hope was enough to guide entire crowds. His psychological mastery consisted of anticipating human reactions and using them to his advantage. Not out of cruelty, but out of understanding. He knew that those who control emotions control the narrative. Thus, Machiavelli became a puppeteer of thought. His hands did not touch bodies, but moved minds. And he did it without violence, without exposure, without leaving a trace. Every external action that aligned with his interests was a silent triumph. A reminder that true power does not lie in visible strength, but in invisible influence. Machiavelli did not need to conquer by the sword, because he had already learned to conquer by the mind. Segment 10. Emotion as a tool of power. For Machiavelli, emotions were not enemies to be repressed or weaknesses to be hidden. They were precision instruments, moldable materials with which he could build or destroy. He studied them as an anatomist of the human soul, understanding that every act of power rests on an emotional foundation. No law, army, or speech can stand without an emotion driving it. Instead of fleeing from this truth, he embraced it. He learned to manipulate feelings not to feel them, but to direct them toward a purpose. Where others saw emotional chaos, he saw raw energy ready to be channeled. Fear was his sharpest chisel. He discovered that nothing unites the masses like the shared threat of danger. Fear does not destroy, it shapes. It does not weaken, it guides. A frightened people seek leadership, and he who offers protection, real or illusory, gains obedience. Machiavelli understood that the most stable power is not built on love, but on the emotional vulnerability that fear reveals. Controlling collective fear was like holding an invisible rope tied to the heart of each individual. By simply tightening it, he could move armies, change laws, or stop rebellions without shedding blood. But fear was not enough. Guilt was the second tool in his arsenal. Machiavelli understood that the human mind tends to submit to those who manage to instill the feeling of moral debt. Guilt is a prison without walls, a weight the individual voluntarily carries. He learned that by awakening this feeling in others, he could keep them under control without visible coercion. The guilty seek redemption, and he who offers forgiveness becomes their spiritual master. Subtly, Machiavelli discovered that the most effective emotional control is not imposed, but granted as a release. And when fear and guilt had fulfilled their purpose, hope entered the scene. It was the most delicate and dangerous emotion of all, because it disguises itself as light while softly chaining. Machiavelli used it like an architect who promises a dawn after a long night. He understood that people are capable of enduring suffering, oppression, and loss as long as they believe that everything has meaning, that the best is yet to come. Hope in the hands of a strategist is a drug that dulls rebellion. It is no coincidence that empires last longer when a glorious future is promised than when a perfect present is imposed. His mastery lay in using each emotion with the precision of a surgeon. He knew when to awaken fear to contain, when to invoke guilt to subdue, and when to fuel hope to sustain. Everything was balance, an invisible symphony of human reactions played by invisible hands. For Machiavelli, emotion should not be denied or fought. It should be directed like a river that can flood or fertilize depending on who controls its course. Thus, he turned emotions into his language of power. He did not need punishments or rewards, only a deep understanding of what moves men. In dark psychology, this mastery represents the highest point of control. Not mastering bodies, but the emotional states that drive them. Machiavelli was not a cold monster. He was a strategist who understood that emotions should not be feared but obeyed. Because he who knows how to manipulate fear, guilt, and hope needs no crowns or armies. He already rules from the minds of others. Segment 11. The Legacy of the Cold Strategist. Machiavelli's legacy was not ink on paper, but a mental model that survived the centuries. His thinking did not age because he was not talking about politics but about human nature. His work is a dark mirror where every generation can contemplate the hidden structure of power, desire, and manipulation. He understood that history changes, but the human psyche does not. Impulses, fears, and weaknesses remain the same. That was his immortality. Having deciphered the internal mechanism of human behavior with the coldness of a soul surgeon, Machiavelli taught that the human mind is the ultimate battlefield, the place where the quietest and most decisive wars are fought. An army is not needed to subdue a nation. It's enough to control its emotional narrative. He who controls what people fear, love, or hope for, governs without the need for thrones. That was the strategist's legacy, to reveal that power is not exercised with swords but with understanding. Understanding the invisible, what moves men when they believe they are acting of their own free will. His coldness was not cruelty, it was vision. He understood that collective emotions could become tools of control, and that leaders, lovers, or enemies who knew how to use them became architects of others' destinies. The dark psychology that emerged from his mind is not an invitation to abuse, but a warning map. It describes the rules of the game that most ignore. Emotional influence is inevitable, and those who do not master it end up being shaped by it. Machiavelli's thinking is, in essence, an anatomy of psychological power. It teaches that morality is relative, that virtue is a mask, and that truth on its own has no force without the emotion that sustains it. Every word, every gesture, every silence can be a tool of control or a doorway to defeat. Machiavelli showed us that dominion does not depend on chance, but on a deep understanding of the mind, his own and that of others. The cold strategist left behind a legacy that is uncomfortable, because it exposes what no one wants to admit, that we all manipulate, and we are all manipulated, that human relationships are a constant exchange of power disguised as affection, duty, or morality. His teaching was not about how to be ruthless, but about how not to be naive. He taught that the true winner is not the one who destroys the enemy, but the one who makes the enemy think, feel, and act according to their will without realizing it. And so, his legacy became eternal, because as long as emotions exist, power will exist. And as long as there is power, Machiavelli's name will continue to whisper in the minds of those who understand that dominion is not conquered outside, but within the human soul. He did not create monsters, he revealed them. He showed that control does not come from hatred but from knowledge. And those who understand the workings of fear, ambition, and guilt no longer need to impose themselves because the entire world begins to move to their rhythm. Here are 2 more dark psychology videos. Watch them, and you will become a being of high psychological power.